Hi, so I am joined today by Max Callis. Welcome, Max.
Hi, Emma. Hi.
Hi. So Max is a career coach. What makes his approach really unique in my eyes is that he comes from a background of design strategy. So he employs design strategy in career coaching, which I think is both a unique and really, really useful approach. So keen to get into some details and talk to you on that subject. Tell me, as a starting point, Max, tell me a little bit about your background and your career history to date.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma. I think it probably begins with a bit of bad advice I received from my grandmother, actually, when wasn't
That's a great starting point, isn't it? All good conversation should start there.
I wasn't asking for advice at the time, obviously. Grandmothers don't need an invitation, but she said, why not do what the hell you like until you're 29, and then you should probably spend a year learning how to be 30. And I always understood that to be, be a kid as long as you can, but when you can't, don't. Unfortunately, the advice didn't serve me all that well, because by the time I was 29, I'd actually picked up quite a lot of momentum in the wrong directions. But it did lead me to have quite a varied and interesting CV, as people tend to say, where you could find almost everything there. Harbour master, kindergarten teacher, DJ, novelist, government researcher. But in the process of reaching 30, I did make a change in my life and decided it was time to try a few more serious things, and got involved in corporate life at Lloyds Banking Group, where I was very fortunate to find a role as a kind of in-house upstart in the innovation labs. And that is really where my relevant experience began, because I began in the strategy side, looking at innovation and strategy, but then shifted halfway through my 5 years there into the culture side. And this has been very formative for me. I'm a strong believer in success lying in that crossroads between strategy and culture and where they come together. And for me, design was an emerging methodology or way that we could bring those two worlds together to create success. So my world was all around innovation, design, strategy, and culture. And after my 5 years in the innovation labs in the UK at Lloyds Banking Group, I set about some other ventures working on the agency side, helping to, I used to say my speciality is helping banks be a bit less shit.
A life career there, isn't there?
Oh, there's a lot of work to be done. Job for life. But I really enjoyed that world of innovation and about trying to create change around organizations and deliver those projects, which I did culture side. And then also I set up a charity to do a worldwide hackathon to help the United Nations deliver on its sustainable development goals. Partly to atone for having worked in the banking industry. It was to cleanse myself at the end of it. So quite a strange, peculiar journey, my own one, but ultimately it led me to deciding I didn't want to do innovation and change so much around organizations and projects anymore. But what I really found was the little atoms inside the projects, the people. That's where the change happens. And having always had this fascination with careers and what they mean in our lives, I think after sleep, it's probably what we all share in common most.
Yeah. And from a time perspective as well, isn't it? It's the thing after sleep we probably spend the most time doing.
90,000 hours estimated in our lifetimes. And at this point, maybe I'll just kind of set up the terms as I understand them around design strategy and career coaching. So we're starting to get into this discussion around careers and the nature of careers in the world today. The world is extremely confusing. I've got my mum who says, I'm so glad I didn't grow up in your time. It looks so confusing. There's a lot of sympathy there. And, the expression VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, I think is a really nice description of this baffling times we live in. And it's exhausting. It's very hard work, a lot of pressure on ourselves. There are 500,000 different job descriptions, job titles in the world.
Wow.
And it's no wonder that we're exhausted, and with all the connectedness and the pressures in a world that's ultimately still rooted in survival of the fittest, it creates a lot of pressure on us as individuals, and it's not, I think, particularly fair the way it's set up, the culture around this. And I think it's up to us to make things better for ourselves. Obviously, I would say that I think coaching is a route to that. But the situation is difficult, and depending on what you read, there are statistics suggesting between 50 and 70% of people are unhappy in work. I mean, let's take that with a pinch of salt, but I think we're all aware that work comes with stress and challenges around it that aren't always positive. For me, I quite like this quote from E.O. Wilson, who's actually a biologist, but he says the main problem today is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
Wow. And I like that.
Boy, that pulling together of no wonder we're confused. No wonder it's difficult. And at the forefront of that, we have our careers, which is such a significant part of our identities and our well-being and our life journeys, that I think it's appropriate we put a bit more time and effort into it and help one another better. So that's the situation as I understand it around the world in our careers. It's tough. I think we've all grappled with it at some point. In terms of coaching, people do understand coaching a bit differently. So I could just outline my understanding. Is I see it really having three parts, actually. Ultimately, the coaching is around helping people to achieve some specific goals. But the three parts that flow into that partly is counseling, actually. So that is around the aspect of reflecting, looking back, and trying to identify patterns in thinking and behaviors so that we can understand ourselves and our part in the journey so far. And then we know what we're working with from the past and the characters involved. But also, I think there's an element of mentoring. So mentoring is an opportunity to share experiences where relevant with the clients. And I think it's really helpful and reassuring when we do overlap with someone and they say, oh, you know, I've been there too.
Absolutely.
I've had worse situations and this and things that can be of benefit. It's, you know, if someone else has trod a similar path, you know, that can offer a lot of support and consolation. The third part is consulting. And this one's a little bit curious because some coaches would say you must never offer any solutions to the client. They must find their own way. I feel that it's okay personally, and I check in with the client and sound them out and say, well, how do you feel about this? But I do feel it's appropriate actually to make some suggestions. And it's actually up to the client to say whether they feel that resonates for them or not. So I have a slightly different view on that than some coaches.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with you. And I think through my own experiences and people that I've worked with, there's almost an expectation from them that that's what they want in a lot of instances. Yes, you can guide and you can prompt, but so often they actually want someone to help them get there.
I find it can almost be a bit disingenuous to assume that they can't learn without working everything out for themselves as a client. I think I often work with people and provide some half solutions, which they can, I might provide a bit of a building and they can furnish it, or the other way. And I think having a more collaborative approach rather than, I've had some psychologists in the past, and I found it a bit annoying when they said, I knew that would happen. And I thought, oh, why
don't you bloody tell me then?
I think I could have saved some time here, actually. So yeah, I do tend to offer more solutions maybe than other coaches might. And that's a conscious decision that I think is important. So that's careers and coaching and how I feel they fit into the world. Looking on the design strategy side, so there are some differences and some similarities with design and strategy. For me, they are both about improving future experiences using a set of recognized methodologies. That's where I think we're aligned. It's about trying to make the future better in a conscious way. But I think there are some differences worth noting on as well, actually. So design for me is more problem focused. It's much more about looking and understanding the problem. I do feel there's a bit of a feminine quality to the design compared to the strategy, actually, which is design is a bit more subtle, a bit more patient, a bit more non-linear, and is a bit more around understanding the why and the how. Whereas for me, strategy, which is a bit more solution focused, is probably a bit more of a masculine side, which is a bit more direct. It's about winning, it's about achieving. And I hope the use of genders there is something that comes across clearly as a helpful thing. But I think a lot of us would feel that sometimes we're a bit too solution focused and sometimes a bit problem focused, and trying to bring that balance together. I do find balance is one of the few words in the dictionary that I can't argue with.
And one of the hardest to achieve, I would add as well.
It is. So yeah, to summarize, I'd say that design is a bit more about the deeper understanding of why and how. It's a bit more nurturing, a bit more patient and understanding. The strategy is a bit more about, well, what are we going to do and when? So I think it's nice. There's an element of, having a sort of mother-father aspect sitting on your shoulder. If you've been fortunate enough to have good parents in your life, there's a little bit of that kindness and discipline, perhaps, trying to build a bit of balance. And the last thing probably to mention on that, around sort of locking down these terms, is just to say that experience design has been where I've been working mostly in the last 10 years. And the thing I loved about experience design is we used to have one team that made a product or a service and another team that did the marketing. So one team was setting the expectations and another team was setting the reality of what the experience actually was. And it was quite often that the customer's main source of disappointment was their expectations were not the same as the reality.
Yeah.
So experience design was a lot around trying to harmonize between the product or the service and the expectations around it. And I think it's a similar situation. And this is where I've shifted into career coaching, but I continue to have that same understanding that expectations minus reality equals satisfaction. That's attributed to various people, Morris Sarchi being one of them, from the advertising world. But I think, you can trace it through to Buddhism as well, if you like, around, what is it? Our expectations are what we get hung by, and rid of the, I forget the words now. Anyway, losing the desire is the secret. But trying to bring together expectations and realities. And I think it's fair to say that with every client I've worked with, there's always an element of, yes, trying to change the reality of their situation, but there's always a shift to take a different understanding about themselves or their situation or their expectations, which need, again, to come back into balance. But hopefully that nails down these terms around what is career coaching, what is design strategy, because I wouldn't want anyone to not be clear on that while I explain how I work with clients, really.
Yeah. I think we're going to get into some examples and ways that people can perhaps start to think about this in their own lives. But I think it's really useful, just talking about reflection, to just kind of perhaps reflect just before we go into that, and just thinking about, my own career and my own life. And I think we're probably of a similar vintage, but when I was in school, it was just, what are you going to study? What are you going to do for your A-levels? If you're going to university, what are you going to do? And then somehow magically you're just going to end up in this career. And somehow you're just meant to know, intrinsically know what you're meant to do or good at. And I do remember it being so hard. And, I had a few ideas. Back in the day, I wanted to be a stockbroker for some reason. I'm not sure where I got that from, but then I wanted to go into, consultancy, and partly because I was studying economics, and so that sort of felt like the right sort of route. But no one, or certainly in my experience of education, no one really helped me or gave me a framework to think about that. And I suspect that is the same for the vast majority of people, that certainly at the beginning of their careers, they just find themselves doing a particular thing almost by accident, and maybe they're good at it, maybe they're not, maybe they love it, maybe they don't. I suspect that's the same for a lot of people.
I think so. I think there's two rules growing up these days. One is you're not allowed to say Voldemort's name out loud. And the second one is you cannot ask for help with your career. It's cheating.
Exactly. Yeah, and you're somehow meant to know, and everyone talks about, my purpose. And somehow you're magically meant to know what this is. And some people do. But I do feel that for the vast majority of people that it is a kind of a utopia that they don't really know how to get to.
Yeah. It's It's a fascinating one. I think probably the subject doesn't arise because a lot of people aren't qualified to have an objective view
Yeah.
of it and hold that conversation in an appropriate, responsible way.
Mm.
But also, it's a deep, deep philosophical question. Oh,
It
hello. What
is.
would you like to do for the
I
rest of your
know, for the rest of your life.
Oh, sorry. Do you mind a moment? I might have a cup of tea to get me through this one.
Biscuit.
The pressure around it is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think there are ways to take the pressure off, which is partly to understand we are likely to have different stages to our career. But I do feel the challenge is around knowing ourselves in the future is a big part of it.
Yeah.
How do we, I don't know what I want to have for dinner tomorrow. So
Yeah.
how do I know what I want to
Yeah.
do for the rest of my life? I think there are ways to get some clues, but we will never have concrete answers. You will not have a computer that spits out, an arranged marriage equivalent of work
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
These, we can generate some suitable suggestions, but it will always be down to us. And I do think there's a little bit of avoidance because of the responsibility involved in making that kind of commitment. There are some thoughts around how, as adults, we're generally held ransom to the irrational and immature thoughts of our 18-year-old selves. And that's why sometimes we need to just take a bit of time to take stock of our thinking patterns and our behaviors and acknowledge that we've been required to grow up a bit before our time and make decisions before we have sufficient information, and not to blame ourselves. It is one of the hardest questions we have in our lives. I think it's appropriate that we try and work with it, but with a kindness and compassion. And at this point, I think I'd love to reference the School of Life's publications. I think for anyone who enjoys getting a good book out and dwelling on the philosophies around work, Alain de Botton, the philosopher, is, I think, unparalleled in how he writes beautifully and clearly around the struggle, the emotional struggle as we try to work out who we are and what we want to do. So yeah, I find, dipping into philosophy is a nice area, but we've also got the practical side of, well, there's a shelf life for that because I actually got to pay some bills and get on.
Yeah, exactly.
But if we can, to nurture a bit of both sides. I'll come to some tips at the end on perhaps how we might choose it. But at this point, maybe I'll just drop in one, which is a tip in advance, which is, I think it was Elizabeth, I forget her name, Elizabeth, someone who mentioned this, but ultimately, I think the biggest mistake we probably all make is we choose our jobs based on the shiny bits, the bits that we most obviously love and want to do. And I think it'd be more appropriate if we made our career decisions based on the shittiest bits and our capability to handle doing the shittiest bits of those jobs. All jobs have got good bits and bad bits for ourselves and what we prefer and don't prefer. I think it's easy to take an example of, an actress and say, well, yeah, I want to be in that movie and I want to meet those other people and I want to do that dramatic role and research the role and dive into it and travel the world. But, the horrible hours in makeup and all the rest of it, and doing a job interview for every new role you're aiming for, doing a job interview once a month may not suit some people. So I think to base it on the worst aspects of the job, not the best aspects of the job, is something that we've probably fallen for at some point.
That's a really interesting point. And I think, again, just kind of reflecting on my own career, sometimes when I've chosen to leave something or chosen to walk away from it, it is ultimately for that reason, that the bad side of it, the balance was no longer there. The good no longer outweighed the bad. The bad started to outweigh the good. That's a really interesting way to think of it. I like that.
Perhaps we should look at some examples.
Please, yes, that'd be great.
I think I should stress at this point that working with my clients is confidential, so I won't be using anyone by name or any revealing details. But I think there are some cases that are okay to just to provide a bit of insight in how design strategy comes in here. So to start with quite a basic example, there are a number of people who come in just confused. I don't know what to do. It's around the direction to go in. And a methodology from design and strategy is the interview. Let's talk about it, but it's also important to have the right questions in there. And what I've found is I've got a questionnaire on my website My marketing team will shoot me because I forgot to even say that I work as thelastcoach.co.
Please. Yes.
So the website, thelastcoach.co, there's a questionnaire on there for people to register if they're interested to work together. And I've had a number of people who just say, well, you know what, the questionnaire has just been really useful to give me a moment to pause, reflect on my career. And actually, it's given me a few thoughts that I'm going to explore. And fantastic. I'm delighted if there's any help that can be done. I've really adopted this job working as a career coach as a bit of a preacher missionary type role. I'm just delighted every time people can be helped and be spared pain, which I've had myself over periods of my career. So yeah, we found that some people, just by having a moment to reflect and not be caught up in their job for a little bit of time and reflect, has given people enough to help. So very, very simple, low tech solution, just by a bit of reflection with the right questions, there's an opportunity to do it. So that's a very straightforward one. A more specific
questions are on there, Max. Can you give us an example of just a couple of what those questions are?
I could give a couple. I wouldn't want to spoil too much, but there's
one.
there's one in there which is, what job description would you, if you went to a dinner party and you wanted to impress everyone and you would never see them again, what job title, if you had to lie, what job title would you make up to impress everyone there? So we want to kind of reveal what is your most grand vision for yourself. So that sort of sets the upper bar, and then we've got some other questions around setting the lower bar, and we start to get a picture of the bandwidth in which we're operating and just starting to tune into different aspects of ourselves. I do feel knowing ourselves is a vital part, and that's why it's so bloody hard when we're younger, because we've still got such a long way to go and we don't fully know ourselves at that point. Very, very fortunate for those people who do have a feeling or an inclination or a calling early on. And I'm dying to find statistics, if anyone can help, around the people who actually end up working in what they studied at university.
It must be incredibly low, mustn't it? Incredibly low.
Anyway, I'm dying to find out the answer to that somewhere. But so there's questions around that. I think there are questions around what you would like to tell a younger version of yourself, which is around trying to sort of reconnect a little bit there as well. And remember that we didn't have all the information at that time. So, our decisions back then were the best we could do at the time. So these kind of questions that give us a chance to throw back a little bit, shoot into the past, a little bit shoot into the forward, shoot into the future. But sci-fi films don't really tell us about the future. They actually, they tell us about how we feel today about the future. So shooting off to the past and the future is a nice way to help reflect on ourselves in a short few sentences.
Yeah. I think it's really useful giving a few of these case studies. It obviously gives people an idea of what the process looks like, but I'm sure, as you're talking, people can see themselves in that scenario, and people are starting to ask themselves those questions. What would I say in that scenario? What would I choose? I think that helps to make it real for people.
Yeah, it's nice to think about it without thinking about it, because when you're presented with what do you want to do with yourself for the rest of your life?
Exactly.
How do you want everyone else to look at you when you introduce yourselves? And you're like, well, we're very judgmental about what we do for a living, because unfortunately, it probably is the most descriptive piece of information to get a handle on someone.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better piece of information. I'd love to say, hi, I'm just a nice human being, but it's a bit too vague. So it's a handle by which we will be held for long periods of our life. So a lot of pressure, and if we can think about it indirectly, it can often tease out a bit more helpful answers than taking on the full looking down the barrel of such an almighty question. If we perhaps consider, there's some other cases there. There was there was a guy who checked in last year, basically talking about sort of a lack of motivation and saying, well, it's a tough year. We've all had a tough year. I'm just worn out, and I really need some support to get my mojo back, because I'm struggling to get out of bed and face it. And I don't think he's alone.
No, I suspect I speak to a lot of people in my role, and as is a very universal, universal feeling, that one.
Yeah, so quite common, but we dug around this. So there's a methodology known as the 5 whys, which is basically just being a small child and asking why and more
Why?
times than you think is right. So when we looked at why he was worn out and exhausted, we dug down quite deep actually, and the hypothesis that this was around, COVID going on, lots of working from home, got to do work and life, and it's stressful, and there's no release in social interactions and no
Hmm.
hobby interest, and life's shut down and the world is gloomy, is a very plausible reason for this. But actually digging down deeper, we discovered that there was actually some confidence issues there that had been unsettled. And what I've seen that going on is a lot of, when the tide goes out on our lives, such as with a pandemic, we're left quite exposed, and some old things that we've probably brushed over in usual life have
Yeah.
become exposed again.
Mm.
There were some confidence issues that, with less interactions with people, a bit of kind of fear around that had grown, and a lack of confidence, a lack of match fitness, to be honest.
Mm.
That's the
Mm.
workplace. But then, even though that was interesting and a valuable insight, we kept going deeper actually, and discovered that the source of the lack of confidence related to some experiences younger as a child. And at this point I said, I think I'm reaching the end of my experience. I'm not a trained counselor, and
Mm.
it wasn't anything too complex, but I think it was interesting that digging down deeper and deeper, we got to the aha breakthrough moment of the guy going, it's so true. Whenever I've run out of steam, that pattern has been going on.
Wow.
And this time he's got the benefit of not having to repeat the cycle. It's his,
Yeah.
in his destiny now. So that kind of digging, I don't think we could kind of take ourselves that deep in a conversation, hence the benefit of, having someone else to take that journey with.
Mm.
So that's the 5 whys as a design
Yeah.
methodology being applied in career coaching.
I
Then,
love that. Sorry to interrupt. I love that analogy of the tide going out. I think,
yeah,
obviously there were lots of challenges within COVID, but I do feel that that was the opportunity. If people were able to get there, that it really stripped everything back to its most basic level and gave us the opportunity and the time in some instances to actually reflect on the big questions of who am I, what am I doing, what's life all about.
absolutely, yes, yes. I think
Not
there's a theme.
not easy, but
Yeah.
if you're able to, some quite enlightening things can come out of that.
Yeah. I often tell myself not to waste a good crisis. There's generally something good to be learnt in there if we can get past the painful bits. And there is a lot of pain going on, actually. It's fair to say, and I think there is while all individuals are that I work with are quite unique, there is we're in a certain period of a certain era at the moment, and there is definitely a lot of reflection being going on, rethinking ourselves. There's a political scientist called Ulrich Beck who talks about reflexive modernity after the millennium, which was already a period of reflecting. We reached modernity and found modernity was a bit shit and disappointing. And couldn't we do better? So the world was already trying to rethink itself, if you would listen to someone like him. And then this just turbocharged it.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's ever been more desire for people to change their approach to change the relationship with their working lives. But also I think there's probably never been so much fear around it at the same time, because economic reality and uncertainty is pulling us the opposite way. So there's a lot of conflict, I think, between our aspirations and the quiet voice saying, I don't think this is right, or this isn't working for me. And then the loud, fearful one shouting, get on with it.
Yeah, need to pay the rent next week, need to pay the mortgage, get it done.
Realities cannot be ignored. But I think if we can provide a bit of breathing space and thinking time for people to try and, keep doing what you're doing, but also get some little pockets of time to start thinking about these things, you can get your destiny a bit more back in your own hands. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating time. One thing, there's been a lot of chat around side hustles, and a lot of people have something.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Well, there's there's a client I work with, and she had a corporate role, but also a side hustle, and was thinking, oh, I don't know, do I leap? And the decision was becoming quite distressing because of the pressures that they're quite black and white. Having also, I've worked in corporate life and startup life, and there is an immense cultural gulf between one and the other that is a big leap to make. But what we did in order to make the decision bearable was a series of scenario planning, looking at both the options going well, looking at both the options going badly, trying to take into account, the likelihood of each of them. So this is where, from straight out of the design playbook, scenario planning came in. But we did one more step, which was we projected their persona. We kind of checked in on this person's character, but we also just played it out into the future. We tried to extrapolate 5-10 years ahead, which always must be done with a pinch of salt, but there are certain things with life events coming along that, they might make you a bit more conservative in future, etc. And recognizing it's possible to project ourselves a bit more into the future and just say, well, I don't know, but that's possible. And then also to reflect on the decision, not just from the person now, but from that future persona. I think the other thing to state is that career conversations tend to be very wordy, or the books are very wordy. And I'm a design strategist, so I tend to turn things into pictures. I am still trying to practice my cartooning. My dream is to be a cartoonist, actually.
That's what you'd say at the dinner party, is it? If someone asked you, you'd say that.
I'd love to be a political cartoonist. That would be my own personal dream. I'll get one.
That's great.
But I try to bring in visual elements, and I think visualizing this rather than having a very text decision to make helped bring it to life for this. Particularly the projecting someone in the future and trying to say, well, we also looked back at the younger equivalent of this lady and said, well, there's the younger you, there's you now, and we think this is you older, to try and get the 3 dots on a graph to have a coherent map, and having that sort of visual picture of someone aging. Actually, we use an aging app as well. You can put your face in and age it, and it just goes, whoa, helps you think a little bit differently, which is a bit, it's where the innovation and creative side.
Got a question on the side hustle. Do you think social media has overly glamorized the side hustle, and people have got this overly glamorized idea of what that is?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to have a more diplomatic answer, but I do feel it's not a balanced conversation.
No.
I'm at the same time, I'm still in favor of kind of everyone having a go at it.
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of, why not? I mean, also it's an amazing learning opportunity. If you approach it as a learning opportunity, wonderful, because you can't fail to learn by having a side hustle.
Exactly.
If you approach it as I think the expectations are for quick success often, and most people who go on to succeed have either taken them a long time or they've had a series of failures first. And I think the unrealistic expectations around it come from, I would get on Medium. There's good articles about side hustles on Medium, which are a bit more balanced than mainstream media around this. But I do think there's a degree of glamorization. I still think it's something that most people should have a go at, because you can't fail to learn about yourself. And it's like, when you're lying in bed and you think, oh, I quite want to have a pee, but I can't be bothered. I've got a rule where if I think it twice, I just go. So in the same way, if you think twice about
you heard it here first, people. Top tips from
if you think, and the other thing is, I think if you're thinking, oh, I wish I had a side hustle, no, you don't. If you have a specific one, like should I go and make a jam? Great, go and make a jam. But if it's, oh, I'm going to do a side hustle, and then you start trying to choose what to do, it's your ego probably, rather than your deeper personality trying to create something in the world for your own satisfaction, potentially commercial benefits.
On that, sorry, we're going off track slightly, but I think it's quite interesting. I've got another question that comes from that, is I wonder if social media is also slightly glamorized entrepreneurship, and particularly for younger generations starting their careers. They look at various CEOs or influencers, content creators, and they think, oh, this is an amazing life, I should go and do this, and it's become quite
Yeah.
glamorized, and they don't perhaps necessarily see, I mean, I guess it's social media in general, you don't often see or ever see the downsides or all the work and all the sacrifice that's perhaps gone in behind the scenes.
I really like that you've included the word sacrifice, because I do strongly agree that entrepreneurship, I feel, is a bit like the side hustle, really. It's wonderful, but if you want to do entrepreneurship, no, you don't. If you want to set up a specific thing, that sounds credible. But yeah, I think there's a lot of glamour around it, and I again, it's that thing where if it speaks to you, great, but if it doesn't, that's okay. You know, I have worked with some people actually who are drawn to more attractive things, and actually there's loads to be said for the safe, steady, boring job. You know what? It doesn't have to. That's great. That might work really well for you. And actually, when the tide goes out and the economy falls down, and you're, you know, you might be. I think there are some roles around the government which are a bit less thrilling and exciting than in the private sector, for example. And it's a bit of a generalization, but there's some truth to that. Those slower, steadier jobs, you're in a fantastic position when times are tough, and actually. It's slow, steady, regular holiday. They look after you. The security that comes with it is fantastic. So, you know, I think again, it comes back to knowing yourself. How much can you handle the crappy bits? Can you handle the risk, the downside? And we come back to that comment about, you know, we get distracted by the shiny bits.
Yeah, very true.
Actually, just dig down on what the hard reality is, and that word sacrifices is a really good one, because that also relates to the ability to focus as well. I'm very aware my own ability to focus I find it very, very hard to do. I have a bit of ADHD and dyslexia, which doesn't help, but I sort of take it upon myself to minimize. I know that I have that information, I can work with it, but focusing is so hard. We want everything. Yeah, I think we're quite spoiled as human beings, living in very generous times, but the spoiledness has not necessarily helped. So
no, I would agree.
Being aware of sacrifice is really, really important, and that's where again we get into the expectations versus reality side. You know, I have worked. There was one person I worked with actually who had, I don't know if it's a clinical term, but to be honest, quite a deluded sense of what would be appropriate. And it was around becoming an influencer, but an influencer of, I don't know what, I just want to be an influencer. And that was, again,
up there with I want to be famous. Well, famous for what?
Yeah, a bit like that. And so sometimes the expectations are a bigger part of the work than the adapting, you know, the reality, because if the expectations are very far off the scale, it's quite hard to get, you know, what's the next right step, which is what always got to be like, what's the next right step, bring it back to that. So yeah, side hustles is a fascinating area.
It is. Yeah, sorry, I took you a bit off track there, but yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I think one that comes up a lot at the moment, and I'm sure driven a lot by what people see on social media.
So there was one that came up that I thought I should bring up, which is because it's less around the individual and the job, but it was actually interpersonal. It was someone I worked with who just found they clashed with people in the workplace, and it's very hard to progress in the workplace when you just struggle to click with other people around you. Most businesses are strongly, you know, run person to person, and those relationships are vital to being successful and enjoying your time. But there's someone who just found themselves very intolerant, and it was really a brave step for this person to kind of confess, like, I just butt heads with people and clash with people, whether they're senior to me or junior to me or the same, it doesn't really matter. And it came down to basically an intolerance and feeling just everyone's idiots, and, you know, can they just not read his mind, frankly. And so what we worked on was, from the toolkit, was we did some empathy mapping to basically make these people less one-dimensional to begin with. Who are these idiots? And to humanize them and bring them to life a bit more, and bring out the little moments where things went wrong between him and other people, and where he could start to recognize his own part in this ultimately. And the rage of kind of calling people idiots in his head was around him feeling he was being an idiot actually, and just struggling to see other people exhibit that same sort of behavior. And it was quite a deep moment for him to kind of come around and go, well, yeah, okay, I'm lashing out at other people. I'm lashing out at myself via other people. And we changed it to a really constructive dialogue, which was taking the kind of what if approach, which is another kind of technique in design of taking the what if to try and spring up some new ideas. And what turned the corner for this person was taking the what if the most aggravating people had the most important lessons for him to learn.
I love that.
So we really opened up his curiosity to help heal the situation, and it helped him pause, not react as much, because he was curious, like, what is this? I've got to learn from this one. And so that's fairly recent, but reports are that this is really shifting, and it'll take time because there's kind of some, everyone now finds him a troublemaker and difficult, but they're sort of cautiously like noticing that attitude there.
I love that. I think curiosity is such an underrated thing and is so useful in so many interactions, scenarios, even from a recruitment perspective, just trying to understand, being curious about, think about when you're interviewing someone for your team, even just being curious about that person will get you to so much more meaningful information than just interviewing them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very much. I mean, try having a conversation with someone who asks you no questions.
Exactly. Yeah,
absolutely. Curiosity is gorgeous. And I think maybe to finish off, there was one more example that might be useful to people listening, in case it resonates for them, but this is a big one. It's just people can have a nag, like something's missing. I don't know what it is. I don't feel fulfilled, and I don't know. Just sort of wasted potential, feeling like I'm wasting my life a bit. And most often checking in with people in this situation, it turns out to be quite often a kind of, well, you don't know what you want. Okay. And so we've got some journey mapping we do around what do perfect days look like. Not that you'll necessarily get perfect days, but actually people quite often haven't taken the time to really say, well, how do I want to spend one good day? What would that day look like? And just by mapping out what good looks like, we can then sort of work backwards from that to say, well, it seems like you enjoy doing this and that, and that's, fits with this kind of role or that kind of role. And it's not necessarily about changing jobs. It's quite often, how to work in the role they've got and make the best out of it. And a useful thing actually that comes in at this point is to talk about ABC jobs, which is, if an A job is like the dream, you're happy all the time and it's utopian working life, which is not probably very real, but let's call it an A minus.
Does that exist? Perfect all the time?
No, sorry to shatter. A minuses, I think, exist.
Yes.
And a B job is, it's pretty good most of the time. And a C job is, it's keeping your head above water, but you don't want to be there long, really. It's just, and it's okay to go up and down the scale, actually. And sometimes you just got to hold on, and just going from C to B can make more sense than being in C and dreaming of your A. So just, it's sometimes I find a good consolation to say, I'm in a B minus, like, and that tends to reflect how long we can hack it. The grade.
I think it probably also gives purpose to that experience, doesn't it? Because instead of just being, I'm not really that happy, there's some purpose there of, well, I'm learning what I'm learning now to get to where I want to get to.
Yeah. Being down, I mean, it's possible to be very unsettled, stressed, anxious, depressed around, but because of our careers, frankly. So there's a lot of pain and discomfort often. Not always the case. A lot of people come in and they want to say, like, I just want to turn it up a dial. I want to turn it up a how do I turbocharge and do it? But the other end of the scale is perhaps from a more down in the dumps kind of position, like I'm struggling.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic not to waste that opportunity, because there are lessons, and quite often clients might not have the expertise, and it's very difficult to be objective, impossible to be objective with your own experience, really. But if someone can kind of just tap your discomfort for a bit and then sort of hold the glass up and say, well, there's a few lessons in here for you, at least it's not wasted. And I find anytime I've had difficult times, I find a massive consolation to feel that it wasn't wasted. It wasn't in vain. I change. And the relief came from working out what I needed to change. And then I could start moving forward again and rebuilding.
Yeah.
In that same way, it's an opportunity. Those painful times and difficult times are an opportunity, but wouldn't it be nice if we could just get something to build back up from a bit sooner? Because it's possible to waste, long periods of our lives being, very sad or upset about things, which, hopefully can be speeded up a little bit with a bit of support. So
I think that's probably a nice segue, and I know we're going to do a couple of tips for people to start thinking about, but I wonder if what you've just said then is a nice segue actually into what are the benefits of working with a coach, and how someone should go about deciding if that's for them or not.
Yeah, no problem. So bear in mind, I'm completely biased as a career coach, but
obviously.
But ultimately, I think there's only three options we have in most things with life, which is, one, we could Google it, and that's great. That's cheap information, but it's fragmented, it's unverified, and takes quite a lot of time to sieve through, and you never get a sort of coherent feel, perhaps, that you've really tested out all your options and worked out your situation as best as possible. The second option would be we ask friends and family. And that's great because it's also cheap and we trust them, but they're also going to have their own biases and may lack experience to be objective. And you may not be comfortable sharing some of the deeper, more relevant things that might be appropriate to get some progress with them. And the third option is to pay an expert, where you're going to get a comprehensive, confidential, objective and experienced view. But yes, there's a price tag. I reckon, depends what you earn, of course, but I reckon I do 6 sessions, which will, the first 3 sessions get you a plan. The second 3 sessions is when we bring the plan to life. And that is in Australian dollars, $925 for the first, $625 for the second bit, about $1,500 to shift your career into hopefully a much better direction and give you that reassurance. And so hopefully if it works for, let's say, call it 3 years, for most people that's like 1% of your salary going on your career. And I've said that if your dissatisfaction is not in your career is not halved by our work, then you get all your money back. So I'd say, like, isn't it appropriate to spend about 1% of your salary making sure your career is as good as it can be? So that's kind of my pitch on why I think coaching's good value. Back to my grandmother, actually, she also told me, she told me lots of very wrong things, but one of the others was, don't worry if something's cheap or expensive. Don't think about it like that. Just ask if it's good value.
Yeah.
And for me, I know there's a bit of reluctance around coaching. It's that thing where society kind of suggests we ought to just have a lightning seed moment and discover our calling one moment. And suddenly you find you're 40 or 50 and it hasn't still happened yet.
Yeah.
But it seems an appropriate investment, I think, for kind of 1% of a average-ish, well, maybe slightly above average salary, just to check in, like, can I do better, and do I feel better as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you get a handmade bespoke plan which is tailored to you, so it's not going to be the generic advice you get off the internet, all lovingly created just for you. So the other thing about coaches is, why not talk to one? Just talk to someone else, but before you do one, talk to 3. It's not a regulated industry, so there's all sorts of people. There are qualified people who are good, and there are qualified people who are rubbish, and there are unqualified people who are rubbish, and unqualified people who are good. So I would personally recommend talk to 3 of them and see who you get a good connection with.
I think I was just going to say that I think that's what it really comes down to is the connection that you feel with that person, because, you know, as you've covered, they're not always going to be comfortable conversations. Some of them are going to be quite difficult. So you want to feel comfortable with that person and want to feel like you can share that sort of side of yourself and that information with the person. And I think until you've had a conversation with someone, you don't necessarily know that.
Yeah, it's good to check in. I think compared to other coaches, I'm probably a bit more, let's grab the bloody thistle.
Yeah.
A bit more frank, and others are probably a bit more gentler, touchy. And it's not to say I'm not compassionate, but I tend to be a bit more frank, I think, than average. That's good for some people, and others may feel that's not right for them.
Yeah.
But in terms of a few tips, I think
yes, let's do that.
Why don't we finish off with a few tips? One of which I've just said was, just talk to a coach. Don't be scared. If you've got any questions, most people are happy to hear from you, but do talk to 3 before you choose one if you want to check out what their terms are. Also, check on their money back guarantee. I think accreditations and things and Google's reviews and things are good to a point, but just talk. Don't let harm in doing that. The next one is also just try and do a bit of work around knowing yourself. So there are tools for this. So the Myers-Briggs test, not actually my favorite, that one, but it's very well known. The Enneagram, I think, is a bit more interesting and revealing. You can do free Enneagram tests online that show your personality type. I would say it's a cross between a horoscope and something scientific. It's a bit spooky, but it's full of interesting, really revealing ideas. You don't have to accept all of it and say, oh, that's me 100%, but it can still be a fantastic mirror to hold up to ourselves and learn about who we are. That's often, a lot of the work is really just checking in on that, because it's not something we can look into ourselves. Another is that articulating what you really want. And there's exercises on my website where you can check in on good days. What do good days look like? So you can just go, well, what do I want my life to look like? And just break it down, that simple step. Also to put in place SMART goals. So that's making sure that if you do set yourself goals, that they are specific, measurable, achievable. I always forget the R, and time bound. But you need to check that you're setting goals in an appropriate way, not in a loose way that's not going to help. Next one would be try to recognize what you can and cannot control, particularly around.
That's a big one, isn't it?
There's a lot of, we often have a lot of baggage around our existing roles that are, there's just a lot of emotions we pick up around work projects, and trying to recognize what we can and can't control. It's great to not waste the energy on those things beyond us in order to have that energy for ourselves and putting into areas where it is required. It's an unfortunate waste where, you know, we have finite energy and we've got to respect it. The other one is mentors. But in terms of getting mentors, I think it's appropriate to know, why do you want that mentor? They must have something you want to have, like a skill or a trait or some aspect of their personality. There's got to be something you want. Identify what it is. I think just asking broadly is okay, but if you know specifically what you want, they can help you specifically. And then you've got it, move on and find another one who's got something else that you want to add to your toolkit.
I think a lot of people feel nervous, or certainly I've had this question in the past. If someone has identified someone that they would like to be a mentor, they feel a bit nervous or unsure about how to approach that person or how to go about it. Would you have any advice around that?
I think just to say that most people are not immune to flattery.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very rare that the hardest reaction you might get is, sorry, I'm a bit busy. And I think it's always going to show as a good reflection that you have interest. So I don't think there's a real downside. I can see that people might be apprehensive. If it's possible, in person is better. But also an email is another option because it doesn't put them on the spot. The other one is just check in with someone close to the person you want to be a mentor. Is there anyone between you and them that you could check in and say, I really like them to be a mentor? You know, if corporate land, assistant, if it's a smaller business world, you know, who do they know? You might just want to sound it out with someone else first. That might help be a stepping stone. But I think try and be aware that there's very little to be, as far as rejections go, even that's a good thing to experience, because we're all rejections here and there. So there really isn't a downside to asking for a mentor, even if it doesn't happen. And the last one was just to say, it's quite a good idea if you want to focus on your CV and your LinkedIn profile, just to try and add on one new experience or skill every 3 months. Just each quarter go, what's that thing I'm going to put up there? Because it's pretty crucial having especially if you're going more corporate route, to have a profile up there, and just make sure you're not adding bullet points to your CV or LinkedIn profile every quarter in your current role. That's a bit of a warning sign.
I also think that's great advice, because what often happens is people don't do that, and then when they come to look for a job and they suddenly have to update their CV or their LinkedIn profile, they actually can't remember all the good stuff that they've done, because it's, they've moved on, and you could be missing some real gold there just because it happened 2 or 3 years ago and you've essentially forgotten about it. So I think that's a fantastic tip to recommend people to do that. I would second that.
Yeah, great.
Finally, I have one final question, Max, which is a question I ask everyone. A little bit of a reflective, kind of philosophical one, but what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Yeah, so I had a quick think about this, and something far better will come to me the moment we stop. However, I can't help thinking about something that actually one of my clients shared with me, and that was a lovely piece of wisdom, which was, if you can't be happy without it, you probably won't be happy with it. And I find that a really beautiful, humbling reminder, because it's so easy to spend a lot of time wanting things, and it's just wanting for wanting's sake. And actually, happiness is largely a choice. It's not entirely, but making happiness, it's a reminder to me not to make happiness contingent on something else that's out of my control. So I thought that was a really beautiful.
I love that. And a good reminder as well. Well, thank you, Max. I think you've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I would hope people listening some really practical tips and advice, some great case studies, and hopefully we can all sort of go away and reflect on what we've learned from you. So thank you very much for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much, Emma, and best wishes to you and everyone in our working lives. Hope we can enjoy them as best as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you.